Thomas Garrett was 53 years old when his estranged uncle's lawyer called with news that felt more like a burden than a blessing. The farm in rural Kentucky, 40 acres of cracked earth, rotting fences, and a barn that hadn't seen purpose in a decade, was now his. He'd never wanted it. He'd spent 30 years in construction, living in a rented apartment 2 states away, asking for nothing from the rural life that had raised him. But debts had other plans. His knees were failing. Work was drying up. The farm, worthless as it seemed, came with no mortgage. So Thomas packed his truck and drove home to a place he'd tried to forget. The first morning, he stood in the overgrown yard and felt the weight of silence. The fields were fallow. The equipment shed held only rust. Then, on the second day, a border collie emerged from the tree line, thin, scarred, moving with the careful intelligence of a dog that had learned not to trust. Thomas didn't choose to keep her. She chose to stay. He named her Scout, and neither of them knew yet that she would see what he couldn't, that the land held secrets worth more than survival. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The kitchen smelled like old wood and mouse droppings. I stood at the window with a cup of instant coffee, watching the sun rise over fields I hadn't seen since I was 18. Scout sat beside me, her ribs still visible under her coat, her eyes tracking every shadow and bird. She didn't trust the farm yet either. I'd arrived 3 days ago with everything I owned in the truck bed. A toolbox, 2 suitcases, a sleeping bag, and a mattress that had seen better decades. The lawyer's letter sat on the counter, the deed stapled to it. 40 acres, 1 barn, 1 house, approximately $8,000 in back taxes owed within 18 months. Or the county would auction it to the highest bidder, which meant foreclosure, basically, unless I could find a way to make this place produce something. I'd spent the previous night fixing the well pump. At least water still ran, though it came out rust-brown for the first hour. I'd cleared the debris from the porch. I'd nailed shut the barn door that hung by 1 hinge. Each small task felt like bailing water from a sinking boat. Necessary, but inadequate. Scout followed me everywhere, her nose low, reading the ground like a book. She moved with precision, the way border collies do, as if each step was calculated. Twice she'd stopped abruptly at the fence line near the south pasture, staring at nothing I could see. When I called her back, she came reluctantly, glancing over her shoulder. By afternoon, I'd made a list on the back of an old feed invoice. Roof inspection, fence repair, at least 2 miles of it. Clear the north field. Find out what equipment still works. Fix the generator. The list went on. The money I had left after the medical bills and the move would last maybe 4 months if I didn't eat much. I sat on the porch steps as the sun dropped low, painting the fields amber. Scout rested her head on my knee, and for the first time since the lawyer called, I felt something other than dread. It was small, barely a flicker, but it was there. The dog believed there was a reason to stay. That was enough to start. Chapter 2. Reading the ground scout's obsession with the south pasture didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. Every morning for the first week, I'd walk the property doing inventory, counting fence posts, marking rotted sections, checking the barn for structural damage. Scout would follow, but her attention always drifted toward that corner of land. She'd lower herself into a crouch, that intense border collie focus locked onto something invisible to me. Then she'd look back at me, waiting. On the 8th morning, I decided to follow her lead. The south pasture was wild. My uncle hadn't worked it in years, maybe decades. Thistle and Queen Anne's lace had reclaimed the soil. The fence rails had mostly collapsed, but Scout moved through it with purpose, zigzagging in a pattern that felt almost like herding, though there was nothing to herd. She'd stop, nose the ground, move forward 30 feet, and repeat. I followed, keeping up as best my aching knees would allow. Near the tree line, Scout stopped and pawed at the earth. Literally pawed, like she was digging for something. I knelt down and pushed away the overgrown weeds. Beneath them I found stone, an old foundation marker maybe, or my breath caught a corner post, the kind used to mark property lines, or... I ran my hands along it, scraping away 70 years of dirt. Carved into the stone was a date, 1947. Scout whined softly, satisfied. She'd found something. She knew it mattered. I spent the rest of the day clearing that corner, pulling back brush and earth. By sunset, I'd uncovered what looked like the corner of a much larger structure, maybe 20 feet on each side, based on the stone markers I found. Too substantial to be a shed, too old to be recent. The earth around it was different too, more compacted, as if something heavy had stood there for a long time. That night, I searched the house for documents. The lawyer had given me a folder of papers. Property survey, deed, tax history. The current deed was from 1987, when my uncle purchased the land. But the previous owner's name on the transfer was faded, and there was no mention of any structure on the south pasture. I pulled out the survey map. My hands shook as I looked at it. The south pasture was marked, yes, but there was a notation in the corner, a series of initials and a date I couldn't quite read, and there, faint but deliberate, was a small square drawn on the map, right where Scout had found those stones. Something had stood on that land, and someone had wanted to remember it. Chapter 3. The Homestead. The local librarian's name was Margaret Chen, and she'd worked at the county library for 32 years. When I walked in with the survey map and the photograph I'd taken of those foundation stones, she looked at me over her glasses and said, "That's the old Garrett homestead." My surname. I hadn't expected that. "Your family?" she asked, pulling out a leather-bound index. "Maybe. I just inherited the property. I didn't know there was anything on it." Margaret guided me to a microfiche machine and pulled up records from the County Historical Society. The homestead had been built in 1946 by a man named Samuel Garrett. According to the property records, it was a 2-story house with a stone foundation and a working kitchen garden. The last tax record dated it to 1972. After that, nothing. "Why did it disappear?" I asked. Margaret's expression shifted. That careful look people get when they know something they're not sure should be shared. "Your uncle bought the property in 1987. The house was already gone by then. My mother remembered it from the 60s. She said there was a fire. Samuel's wife was inside." The words hung in the air. Scout, who'd come with me to the library, pressed against my leg. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quietly. "I shouldn't have." "No, thank you. I needed to know." That evening, I sat on the porch with Scout as the light faded. A fire. A loss. My uncle had bought this land decades after tragedy had reshaped it. Had he known? Had he carried that weight silently, never fixing the house, never developing the land? The farm hadn't been worthless to him. It had been a memorial. Scout rested her chin on my shoulder, and I scratched behind her ears. She'd known something was buried there, not in the earth, but in the story. Dogs know when a place holds grief. If you're enjoying this journey so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and thank you for following Thomas and Scout into this mystery. Chapter 4. What the Stones Revealed. With the story of the homestead, I approached the south pasture differently. I wasn't just clearing land. I was excavating memory. I rented a small tractor from a neighbor named Harlan, a taciturn man in his 70s who remembered my uncle vaguely and seemed unsurprised that the farm had passed to a nephew he'd never met. "Your uncle was private," Harlan said, "kept to himself, but he took care of the land even if he didn't use it much. That says something." Over 3 weeks, I carefully cleared the south pasture, with Scout guiding the work. She seemed to know the boundaries of the old homestead perfectly, herding me in circles around the perimeter as if to say, "Here is what matters. Protect this space." The foundation revealed itself in sections. Stone by stone, I uncovered what had been a main structure roughly 30 by 40 feet, a smaller addition that might have been a summer kitchen, and a stone-lined cellar entrance. Everything was charred on one side. The fire had been fierce and old, but as I cleared the debris, I found something else. Near the cellar entrance, there was a metal box buried in the ash. It was rusted nearly through, but when I carefully opened it, the interior had been sealed somehow, maybe lead-lined. Inside were documents wrapped in oilcloth, still legible. They were deeds, multiple deeds, and mineral rights certificates dated 1946, signed by Samuel Garrett and witnessed by a county clerk. My hands trembled as I read. Samuel had owned not just 40 acres, but 80. And he'd sold mineral rights to something called the Commonwealth Resources Corporation. The payment amount made me sit down hard on the foundation stone, $50,000 in 1946. In today's money, that was roughly $750,000. Scout laid her head in my lap, and I realized I was crying. Chapter 5. The Search. The next morning, I drove to the county records office with photocopies of the documents. The clerk, a woman named Rita, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, spent 40 minutes searching through filing cabinets and microfiche. Commonwealth Resources, she said finally. They were a coal exploration company. They operated in this region from 1945 to 1978. Then they went bankrupt. The company's been defunct for decades. But the mineral rights, I said. Where do they go if the company dissolves? Rita adjusted her glasses. In theory, they revert to the property owner or the heirs. But if no one's claimed them and no one's paid the taxes on them... She trailed off. Let me check something. She pulled up property tax records for the land. Your uncle paid taxes on 40 acres consistently from 1987 onward, but there's no record of mineral rights taxes being assessed. That means either the county lost track of them, which happens, or they were abandoned and never claimed. Which means, Rita said carefully, that theoretically they might still belong to whoever can prove ownership of the original claim. Samuel Garrett's heirs, for instance. I had no siblings. No cousins I knew of, but I had the documents, and I had the land. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started making calls. I found a mineral rights attorney in Louisville who specialized in old claims. He was skeptical at first, then interested, then genuinely invested. By Friday, I'd paid a retainer and he was digging through state records. These mineral rights are valuable, he said over the phone. Coal is commodities. Even if the original company folded, the rights exist. If your uncle never claimed them formally, they've been in limbo. But you can file a claim as the current property owner with proof of descent. What are they worth? I asked, hardly breathing. That depends on the volume of coal beneath the land and current market prices. Could be 100,000, could be more. I'll need to get a survey done to assess the deposit. I hung up the phone and looked at Scout. She was asleep in the corner, her legs twitching slightly as she chased something in her dreams. She had known. Somehow. She had known there was fortune buried in that soil, not in treasure boxes or hidden cash, but in the very earth beneath the stones where a woman had once died. My uncle had known too, I realized. He'd kept the land all these years, never developed it, never claimed the rights. He'd turned it into a sanctuary instead. Maybe he'd been protecting it for someone. Maybe he'd been waiting. Chapter 6. Storm warning hope, I learned, has a way of attracting complications. 3 weeks into the mineral rights claim, a letter arrived from a law firm representing a development company called Piedmont Properties. They were interested in purchasing the land. Their offer was $40,000, double what the property would have sold for based on raw acreage. The timing felt like a coincidence, only until it wasn't. Harlan came by the next day, ostensibly to check on the fence repairs he'd helped me plan, But his expression told me he had something else on his mind. We sat on the porch, and he finally said, "They've been asking around about your place, Piedmont. They got money, but they're not sentimental. They're buying up land in this county because they think there's coal underneath. They're better funded than the old company was." "How did they know?" I asked. "Probably the same way everyone knows everything in a small county eventually. Someone talked. Could have been the surveyor, could have been the lawyer. Don't matter now." That night, a storm rolled in. Real rain. The kind that drums on the tin roof and makes you remember why old houses creak. I lay in bed listening to it, and my mind spiraled. If Piedmont knew about the mineral rights, they'd move fast. They had lawyers better than mine. They had capital. They had no attachment to this land. They saw it as commodity. Scout whined and jumped up on the bed, something she'd never done. She pressed against me, and I realized she was afraid, not of the storm, of something else. Change, maybe. The sense that the world was shifting beneath her paws. The rain lasted through the night. By morning, a section of the north fence had come down, and a corner of the barn's eastern wall had started to separate from the main structure. The wind had gotten underneath it, finding the rot I hadn't yet repaired. I spent the day making emergency fixes, and by evening I was exhausted and discouraged. The mineral rights were a lifeline I couldn't even reach yet. The attorney needed 2 more weeks for the formal claim to process. Meanwhile, Piedmont's letter sat on my kitchen table, a $40,000 temptation written in careful legal language. If I took it, my debts were covered. I could walk away. But I wouldn't take Scout with me. She belonged here now, and this land had already taken too much loss. It deserved better than to become a mining operation. If this rural redemption story has you hooked, hit like, it helps us keep these true-to-life tales alive. Chapter 7. The Reversal. The attorney called on a Wednesday morning. His voice was different, carefully controlled, like he was restraining excitement. "The claim is valid," he said, "more than valid. I've completed the geological survey. There's a deposit beneath your property. Anthracite, high grade. Current market assessment suggests anywhere from $450,000 to $600,000 in extractable coal, depending on mining efficiency." I couldn't speak. "However," he continued, "there's a complication. Piedmont Properties filed a claim simultaneously. They're arguing that as the original company's successor, or some variation on that, they have rights to negotiate first refusal. It's a weak argument, but it'll slow things down. We'll need to contest it." "How long?" 6 months, maybe a year. Litigation is slow." "A year. I could survive that. But I needed income now." That afternoon, Harlan stopped by with news of his own. He'd mentioned my situation to a friend who owned a feed cooperative. The friend wanted to know if I'd be interested in leasing pasture to local ranchers. 10 head of cattle through the summer, standard grazing rate. Nothing glamorous, but real money, $3,500 for 4 months. "It's not much," Harlan said, watching my face. "But it's something. And if you're staying, the community should probably know. Word travels." By the end of that week, I'd signed the grazing lease, started clearing the north and east pastures in earnest, and hired Harlan and his son to help with the repairs. Scout herded cattle like she'd been born to the work. Within 10 days, the first dozen head arrived, and the farm felt alive in a way it hadn't in decades. The barn was still standing, the roof still leaked. But we had a rhythm now. Work in the morning, repairs in the afternoon, sitting on the porch at dusk with Scout's head warm against my leg. The mineral rights claim was moving forward, buried in the machinery of the law. But the land itself had already rewarded us. Chapter 8. Validation. September came with clear skies and a sense of accumulation. The grazing cattle had grazed responsibly, and the pastures looked richer for the work. I'd repaired the barn's eastern wall. The roof still needed work. But I had money for materials now. More importantly, I had time. The attorney's office sent a status update. Piedmont's claim had been formally contested and was headed for arbitration. It would likely be dismissed in our favor, but the process would take months. That's when Margaret from the library called. She'd been doing research on her own, she said. She'd found something I should see. I met her at the County Historical Society on a Saturday morning. She'd pulled together a file of documents related to the original homestead. But more significantly, she'd found a letter dated 1972, 2 weeks after the fire, from my uncle to the county clerk. In it, he stated his intention to purchase the property and preserve it as a memorial to Samuel Garrett's wife and the generations of Garrett family that had worked that land. He didn't just buy it, Margaret said, handing me a photocopy. He was protecting it. He knew about the mineral rights. He could have claimed them, but he chose not to. He wanted to keep it safe. I read the letter 3 times, my throat tight. My uncle, the man I'd barely known, who'd never reached out to me, had spent his life honoring a tragedy that wasn't even his family's. He'd been a guardian, not an owner. And now that role had passed to me, but not in the way he'd imagined. The land didn't need protection from development anymore. It needed restoration. It needed life. Scout rested her chin on the edge of the table, and Margaret reached over to pet her. "She's a good dog," Margaret said. "She knew what this place was before you did." Chapter 9. The Inheritance. The spring after I inherited the farm, the arbitration was formally decided in my favor. The mineral rights were officially, legally, undeniably mine. I stood in the attorney's office and held the papers. $630,000 was the final assessment. Even with the attorney's fees and the claim processing costs, I'd clear enough to pay the back taxes, repair the farm properly, and have capital left over for equipment and stock. But I didn't sign the lease agreement with the mining company. Instead, I called the Agricultural Extension Office and asked about sustainable farming practices. I called a soil specialist. I called a woman named Dr. Elena Reyes, who'd been researching heritage crop restoration, and asked if she'd be interested in a partnership. "You'd let me use the land?" she asked, skepticism clear in her voice. "I'd pay you to use the land," I corrected. "The soil's never been treated with modern chemicals. It's got history. I want to know what that means." By summer, we'd planted heirloom wheat in the north field, the same variety Samuel Garrett's family had likely grown. The south pasture, where Scout had led me to the homestead, I'd officially registered as a historical site. The county was placing a marker there to commemorate the Garrett family. Harlan's son would maintain it. Scout and I sat on the repaired porch on an evening in late July, watching the sunset paint the restored fields gold. The barn stood solid behind us. The fences were mended. In the distance, a family of deer moved through the heirloom wheat, and Scout didn't even lift her head. She'd made peace with this land. It had made peace with her. I'd never intended to be a farmer, but I'd become a guardian of something older than I was, a repository of other people's stories, other people's labor, other people's love. Scout had taught me that. She'd known from the first day that this land held more than earth. It held belonging. Subscribe for more real-life stories of loyalty, land, and second chances. See you in the next one. The land remembers everything, every loss, every labor, every hope planted and tended into being. Sometimes you inherit a farm. Sometimes the farm inherits you, teaching patience through seasons and showing you that redemption isn't singular but cumulative, written slowly in the soil, witnessed faithfully by a faithful dog.